Greetings, and we're going to try and see if I can do a lecture with you guys today. So I wanted to talk today, first of all, let's see if I can get this up and going. Okay, so here we go. This week we want to kick off a little bit talking about performance, why we want to think about performing comics and graphic novels, and then maybe connect that to some introductory information on cartoons and cartooning before we get into kind of the sequential art that Scott McCloud is going to explain to us, and then see if we can practice a little bit our own image manipulation by creating some memes while seeing a kind of connection I hope to foster between memes and political cartoons. So the first thing that we want to do today, this is the plan in this little talk here, is I'm gonna do a really fast and dirty explanation of why we're coming at this with performance, because I think that that's useful and we should do that. But I also want to then look at, through Pierce's text, a little bit of the readings for this week, what are some forms in the political cartoon to pay attention to? And then finally, what is a meme and how might we see a meme as a political cartoon, and why might we pull this all together at the end? So that's the plan for this talk here, and we'll see how that goes. So first of all, I want you to understand that what we do today as performance studies in a communication studies department started out as oral interpretation of literature in a speech communication or public speaking classroom or department. But the performance studies itself is a profoundly rich interdiscipline. The performative turn that happens in the 80s and really flourishes in the 90s comes about as a result of changing conceptions of human endeavor and recognizing performance's central role in it. And as this graphic shows you, there are lots of different trajectories into it. So for example, art becomes more interested in, performance art, happenings, and conceptual art, and challenging the notion of the art object as a singular item. And as it does so, it moves into places like performance art and thinking of performance modes that are different, or related to, but different from theater. We'll focus a little bit more on oral interpretation and oratory. And I'll do that here in a second, so I want to elaborate that. But that there are some things that I think oral interpretation and the oral interpretation of literature bring to talking about performance. Of course, as folks started getting interested in talking about performance, the traditional performing arts disciplines like theater, drama, dance, etc., felt that they had a stake in that turn. Why don't the people who actually make performances have more of a say in its centrality to the work of performance studies in this new developing idea of performance studies? And then, of course, the other big trends were in anthropology and sociology and those kinds of disciplines, where performance was viewed as a human endeavor that was worth studying, and more importantly, that performance was really at the center of why of how we do our culture and how we communicate our culture. That the performances that we do, both on stage but also off stage, in things like overt performance rituals like weddings, became of interest. But then twice behaved behaviors and repeated activities began to take a real theoretical interest in sort of talking about performativity. So all of these different disciplines had a contribution to the idea that performance was important and worth paying attention to, and bigger than just something that happened on stages. Okay, well, let's back up and understand about oral interpretation just a little bit. In the Don Geiger essay that I gave you to read, and I know that that's a little bit dense, but for different reasons. I don't think it's particularly rhetorically challenging or theoretically challenging as much as it is a product of its time, and it is written in 1962 or 63, so it's older than I am. I get that. And I wanted to dip back in there because I think it's one of these important threads that we want to pull and tease just a little bit as we come forward into the 21st century. At the time, what's sort of troubling Geiger in that essay and what he's speaking to is this divide, if you will, in the teaching of oral interpretation, the performance of literature, and in particularly speech communication or oratory areas. There's a tradition from elocution and declamation that oral interpretation pulls from the late 19th and early 20th century. And the focus here was often on developing delivery and focus on good oratorical skills, which included vocal production and nonverbal gestural production. And the idea always was that good literature inspires good performance, that you will become a better speaker if you practice using good literature. But also key to oral interpretation was the idea that the performer is a conduit of the text. Early debates in the early 20th century would try to distinguish interpretation with its more reserved reading aloud qualities from the dramatics of acting and fully embodying a character in dramatic performance, while articulating why it is that declamation and elocution and performance in that mode would be useful and even better in some ways because it privileges the literature, and that's an important thing. Well, Don Geiger is part of a critical turn in literary criticism called New Criticism, very dominant in the middle part of the 20th century. And here, rather than focusing on, say, the biographical history of the author who produced the text and where it was produced, you could actually, from a close textual analysis, get at what was important in the text and understand the text. And in fact, the idea here in this practice was that aspects of the text that you might overlook if you're reading it become much more revealed and made apparent through oral performance, even a simple oral performance of just reading aloud, but even more so as you moved into more fully realized performances. The premise here, though, was not that the good literature just inspires a performance, but that a good performance comes from understanding the text, that before you could actually have the literature transmitted through your body, you had to understand what was happening with it. And that was a necessary reason for doing oral interpretation, was it made you a better reader, not just a better reader out loud, but a better analyzer of texts. And so for Geiger, and for others at that time, Wallace Bacon, Beverly Whitaker Long, others, even I would say Marion Kleinow, for whom our Kleinow Theater is named, a performance becomes a mode of analyzing text, that you will understand literature better through performing it. One of the central premises of oral interpretation is that literature is good for you. It is equipment for living, but it is also best understood not by sitting alone and reading in the privacy of your home or in your bed at night, but by performing aloud for others and taking the time to actually engage performance and engage the text through performance. So let's return to this just a little bit and understand. Oops, there we go. Let's understand this diagram just a little bit here. All of these things have contributions. Certainly theater and drama and dance are doing performance and know something intimate about the production of performances and are going to bring that to the table of performance studies, and that's important. And certainly art has a reason that it is exploring the breadth of art beyond the plastic arts or the sculptural arts or the visual arts to include performing arts. And the idea that performance is, and conceptual art and those kinds of things maybe get around the problematics in the art world of wanting to own an object and how it became, one of the reasons why happenings and performance come to the fore in the 50s and 60s is that art galleries and artists become aware that their art is being bought as investments for the very war machines that they might otherwise want to be critical of. So conceptual art and other practices come about as a resistance to the art market and the marketing of art to create the ephemeral and performance art. Certainly anthropology, sociology, and those other disciplines are recognizing a human practice and want to chronicle it in places beyond where we typically think of performance happening, on stages and in theaters and maybe in rituals. What oral interpretation, communication studies, oratory, public speaking, the performance of literature brought to the table that was so important was the idea that the act of performance itself is a mode of inquiry. That core idea in Wallace Bacon and Don Geiger, that performance was a mode of inquiry, a practice of literary criticism, that performers of texts understood those texts better, opened up the door for performance not just being a thing that we study in performance studies, but performance being a mode or a method of studying, a way of engaging in inquiry. This has always excited me about oral interpretation. And certainly the gift that oral interpretation gives to the interdiscipline of performance studies, to me, is this notion of performance as a mode of investigation and a mode of inquiry. That certainly crops up in art, that certainly crops up in theater and drama, but I think as a rigorous practice, theorized as both pedagogy and as production of performances, I think a lot of ways oral interpretation gave us that even more so than some of these other disciplines. And it is one of the strongest threads, strongest contributions that I think oral interpretation makes to performance studies. So this discovery through performance, right? What does that actually even look like? Well, if you've taken a performance class, you've hit some of these ideas before. First of all, it borrows from a new critical idea, an idea from new criticism, that we're going to focus more on the text itself than some perceived or traceable notion of authorial intent. So prior to new criticism, a lot of criticism focused on who was the author creating this text, where did they create it, what's the background for them creating it, and so forth. New criticism comes along and gives us a whole bunch of tools that are then elaborated in structuralism, post-structuralism, et cetera, a whole bunch of tools for just focusing on the text itself and looking at the things that are happening. What's the narrator doing? What's the language in the text? What's the shape of the text on the page, and so forth. So new criticism and thereby oral interpretation called for us to attend to forms and structures and let them influence performance choices. So if you're performing a poem, you pay attention to things like line endings and stanza breaks, and you try to perform the white space in the performance. You pay attention to the narrative structure of the story and what are the main parts of it, and how does that influence your performance choices? What is the point of view of the narrator, and how does that influence the choices that you make about your relationship with the audience and the kinds of things that you're doing in performance? The idea too was that performance saw that the text is a flat thing, a dead thing on a page. It comes alive. It comes alive as a text when it's brought into performance. Now, I want to take this notion of flatness here and mark it for you, because one of the texts, one of the comic texts, the Susanna's unflattening text that we're going to look at here in a few weeks, plays with this notion of unflattening and argues that one of the things that comics and graphic novels do is take flat texts and flat ideas, and through the combination of words and arts and their tensive relationship with each other, open up an unflattening, a broader, a living kind of mass. It's a similar kind of argument to what I think performance made about why you would want to perform literature. It also, there's a move in oral interpretation across the 20th century away from very restrained performances, often holding the book or having the book present. If you've ever seen forensic competitions, especially college forensic competition, public speaking competitions that have oral interpretation events, the presence of the text as a notebook that you hold in your hand is very much a holdover from that idea of performance. In old school debates about the difference between interpretation and acting, the interpreter is less gestural, less flamboyant, less embodied, all of these kinds of claims. Of course, many people came along and wanted to kind of trouble those fast and easy distinctions. And over time, Breen's notion of chamber theater, other approaches to performing literature began to put aside the idea that it had to be a poor theater or a theater that didn't use those big devices and could use all of the stagecraft of performance to perform. The question that we always ask at the end of a performance, or that we typically ask at the end of a performance, is, was it true to the text that it was working with? And what did it bring to the text? What did the performance allow us to see about the text? And that too then plays into the notion of performance as inquiry. Importantly, performance is inquiry for the performer, but because performance is profoundly a sharing activity, it also becomes a mode of inquiry and sharing of our discoveries through inquiry in the practice of doing the inquiry. It combines those two things in a way that becomes, I think, both really interesting and challenging. Okay. So why did oral interpretation move from being oral interpretation to becoming performance studies? Well, towards the latter part of the 20th century, but really in the 80s, we started to see the rise of cultural studies and the challenge to literature and the literary canon, that suddenly this revered object of study in English departments in the academy for centuries became an item of suspicion. What is the literary canon? What is this canon of things that are capital L literature versus, say, pulp literature or para-literatures or all the kinds of things that popular culture has that aren't true literature? Why are they revered? And what is this quality that they have? I mean, if we look back at some of those elocutionary presumptions that good literature leads to good performance, some of what was challenged was what makes it good, and why is good dominated primarily by dead white European males? What are the other voices that are left out in this literary canon, and how can we get them in? And once you start kind of breaking the canon of the literature, suddenly you open up other possibilities for things for performance to investigate besides just literature. Um, there are a breadth of performance practices that are probably worth our attention and that we can learn from that go beyond drama or literature read aloud. Here's a place where storytelling might come in, and the idea of folklore and those practices seem very related to the idea of oral interpretation, but weren't quite central to its mission, so why not add it in? What about these rituals and regular practices that people like Victor Turner were studying in anthropology? Aren't those sort of part of what we should pay attention to with performance? Once you get away from the idea of a text in a book or on a page as the genesis of performance, suddenly you're opening up all kinds of things that might be recognized as performance and understood through a performative lens. We see the arrival on the stage of interest in first personal narrative, and later that'll evolve into things like autoethnography. You also have a recognition that in the art world, performance art is starting to take off. And what is this that seems related to the drama, related to any focus on the world through a performative lens? Surely there's some other forms as well that attract our attention. And we say, you know, there's more to be seen in connecting these than there is to be seen in separating them out. We start to see that in these modes, performance as a mode of inquiry becomes important beyond just a mode of literary criticism. And so here things like performance ethnography that studies the performances of cultures but also tries to reproduce them, say the work of Dwight Conquergood, um, uh, and other practices that begin to really move us beyond merely locating the performance inquiry in literary analysis and recognize this is a powerful tool. It can be applied beyond just simply textual analysis and literary analysis. It's useful in all of these other contexts. That combined function, and I mentioned this earlier, that combined function, Pelias and Van Oosting in their Paradigm for Performance Studies essay, that is, you know, one of the essential marks in the transformation of oral interpretation to performance studies. One of the things that they note is unique to performance studies is that the tools we use for inquiry, to investigate something, are also the tools that we use to share the results of that inquiry and to make arguments and cases and conversations with audiences about what it is that we're seeing. And that combined function of performance to discover and to share discoveries is probably one of the most exciting contributions that communication studies, oral interpretation, and performance studies from those backgrounds bring to the table. It's also important to recognize that throughout the long history of studying communication, it's going all the way back to one of the reasons why public speaking breaks off from English departments in the early part of the 20th century, is that we've always valued that we learn best by doing. It's great to sit and listen to a lecture, and this is one of the challenges, I think, right now of our current format of doing classes online, is that you can learn something by listening to me give you this talk with some PowerPoint slides and some bullet points. But you're really going to learn better by doing, which is why there's an exercise for this week and why we do performances in this class. And that notion of performative pedagogy, which some call experiential learning, it even has a role, I think, in service learning, is simply this idea that sometimes we learn best by getting our full sensorium and our full body involved in an activity that gives us experience that is just as important as our brains and our eyes in trying to be cognitively aware of what it is that we're learning. The emergence of performative writing, and I'm not going to try and go deep into this at this point. We may talk about it a little bit later as we get into looking at some of the connections between some comics practices and some contemporary writing practices. But the general idea behind performative writing is that one can write in a way that is informed by performance. And that the writing does as much as it represents, that the writing is doing something. And I think once you start combining simple images with words in productive ways, the tensiveness of that relationship is already starting to work in some of the categories of performative writing. Performative writing is a contested subject. There's a kind of broad notion of it that comes from Ron Pelias. That's really sort of any aesthetic essay written in the academy that eschews a kind of academic writing in favor of a more personally oriented, expressive, aesthetic voice. There are others. Della Pollock is probably more famous for kind of articulating performative writing and the kind of performative writing that most people are doing when they're doing performative writing. Hers is a little bit more narrow than I think Pelias's broader definition, and really does focus on the linguistic concept of the performative and the idea that the text itself is doing something. It's not to be confused with, and this is a gripe that some people who work with performative writing have. Writing a monologue or writing a text for performance, while useful, can't be confused with or made isomorphic or synonymous with performative writing, that there is something sort of at a theoretical basis that performative writing is doing. At the same time, the boundaries are porous between all of these practices, and the idea that our writing can already be performative, I think, is an idea that in a different way, graphic novel and comics producers are also exploring. Okay, so what about performance in cartoons? That's the big challenge for this class, right? That's what we're going to start exploring. And I want to start with a couple of simple postulates I'm going to draw based on the kinds of cartoons we're looking at this week. First of all, they're deceptively simple cartoons. They don't seem to have as much text on the page as other forms of writing do. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why comics are sometimes seen, initially comics were seen as a threat to literacy, that they got in the way of learning and being literate. But that they also, later we've learned, they're actually quite good at teaching, especially folks with learning disabilities, to be better readers because of all the extra visual content in them and whatnot. They can do that. When you're talking about single panel political cartoons, they can seem really deceptively simple. And one of the things that performance can do for us is give us a way in to being more aware of the hard work and craft that goes into making cartoons. You can certainly learn by trying to make them, and I encourage you to do so. If you have any inclination towards doodling or drawing, try it. You don't have to be an amazing, accomplished artist to make cartoons and images, particularly political cartoons. In part, the turn that I'm doing to memes this week is in recognition that many of us are anxious about our drawing abilities and tend to think that we can't do that. I would like to encourage you here today that you can and should explore with that possibility. But also, if you're more comfortable just adding some text to an image, that'll get you through this week and what we need to do this week. I think that you can also learn about them by trying to perform them. Certainly the single panel cartoons that we're looking at this week are not going to make for very long performances. That's okay. Think of them as like a performance of haiku if you want. But at the same time, the act of performing them, of taking the challenge of how do I translate these images without necessarily trying to reproduce them on stage, makes you focus in on elements that you might otherwise not see when you grasp the image and the joke really quickly. Don Geiger talks a bit in that essay that you read for today about the relationship of oral interpretation to translation, that to interpret is to translate, and that the work of the performer in performing literature is to translate the text on the page into a live performance. Well, I think we can say the same thing as a mode of inquiry about looking at cartoons, that the challenges of translating this cartoon into a live performance or into a stage performance makes us more aware of their subtle forms and structures. And that's very much in keeping with Geiger's argument that the performer, if they really are going to make good performances, they're going to have to understand all of the elements in the text that they're working with here. And this is going to make us need to pay attention to some of the formal elements of what's going on in graphic graphic novels, comics, and cartoons. So that's why we're gonna spend some time with Scott McCloud's wonderful book, Understanding Comics, written in a comic form, where he really spends a lot of time trying to detail important elements of the form so that we as readers and potentially as performers and maybe even as comics creators ourselves or something related can be better and can understand better the elements that we might take for granted and just kind of sweep by. These challenges, I think, are important. They are, to me, the exciting place. I think for some students who are worried about a grade and worried about getting it right, challenges are terrifying because you're worried that you're going to make a mistake. Let me be clear here. There are not a lot of people working in the idea of performing graphic novels, especially from an oral interpretation background. So we don't have a lot of normative standards to put up against what it is that you're trying to do. If the performance work that you were doing is engaging and it teaches us something about the comic, it teaches you something about the comic and working on it, then I think it's been beneficial, and that's why we want to keep doing it. Okay. So let me kind of move through a little bit, and we're going to move past all of this text here and actually have some things to look at, I promise, and not always will we focus on text here. Political and editorial cartoons. This is from a chapter in a book on rhetorical criticism about visual arguments. And rather than kind of deal with all of the advertising and other examples that Pierce gives us, I wanted to focus in on some of the observations that she makes about political and editorial cartoons. First of all, they tend to be single panel. Pay attention to this right now because I want this to be one of the genres that we attend to in this class. One of the criticisms of McCloud is that McCloud's theory of how comics work doesn't really take into account the single panel cartoon. So let's note that here and recognize that they present a kind of challenge, especially in terms of thinking about doing a performance of it. But they also, I think, that challenge is important. It makes us aware that there's something going on here that maybe changes when you start adding additional panels and putting images in juxtaposition and telling stories across time. The jokes tend to be fast. It's a fast joke that you get pretty quickly, sometimes without even having to read the words. Sometimes they don't have words, but usually you get right away. And it's usually commentary. In fact, yeah, it's usually a commentary, right? It's an elaboration on something current in the news, poking fun at it, making an argument sometimes, and sort of pointedly doing so. They almost always work by some kind of absurd juxtaposition or exaggeration. Some simple idea is exaggerated, some idea in the news is exaggerated to its absurd conclusion, or sometimes two things might be juxtaposed against each other to make an argument or to make a connection that you might not have otherwise seen. And then I think another important aspect of the political or editorial cartoon is that they tend to work like a rhetorical enthymeme. That's a big word, and maybe you don't remember it from your rhetoric classes or your introduction to comm theory class. Just remember that the idea here is that rarely do public speakers present all of the premises in an argument and show you how it reaches to a conclusion. They will leave out premises intentionally because they know the audience can and in fact should fill those in. Part of the argument in persuasion is that when the audience has to engage in filling in the missing premises in an argument, they are engaged in the persuasion of themselves and more likely to be persuaded. And Aristotle, of course, goes on at length about the enthymeme being a defining element of rhetoric. Well, cartoons work similarly in that you probably have to know some of the current event going on to get the references that the cartoon is making, that the political cartoon is in fact referencing. And so that gives them a kind of limited shelf life. You know, if we look at the political cartoons, even in I think the Pierce essay, they're interesting in as much as you're able to discern them in the reproduction there, but they're also of their time. We're not as clued into what it is that they are about. Well, Pierce gives us several elements that we should pay attention to in looking at political cartoons, and I wanted to elaborate maybe with some current event topics and cartoons that we have here. First off, it's the idea that the cartoon has to work with a reduction or simplification of the issue that it's talking about. So here I've got three relatively recent cartoons about the quote-unquote assault on the US Postal Service. Um, let's understand that the U.S. Postal Service has been in some kind of dire straits for a while, in part because of competing understandings of what it is. Should it run like a business, and should it be treated as a public utility or a public service? It is constrained in how it can operate as a service or as a business by rules imposed from Congress, including a relatively recent one that makes them have to fund the pensions of its employees have to be pre-funded for 75 years, right? And so that's a difficult burden that even businesses don't have to operate under. Usually, you invest the money, it accumulates over time, and you're not responsible for providing that. There are other elements about the degrees to which the Postal Service can raise rates and when they can do that and how much they can do that are also stipulated by Congress. There are lots of impacts on the Postal Service. It's a complicated situation. It is in a certain amount of dire straits right now. It does need to be cleaned up. Some of that cleaning up needs to come probably from taking away some of the restrictions that we put on it from the federal government, some of which come from the very people right now, Republicans mostly, who are trying to assault the U.S. Postal Service. There are certainly ideological conflicts involved in that, where there's a difference of opinion about it should be profitable and self-supporting, or it should be, it's a public utility and it's okay for it to operate at a loss because the contribution that it makes to society is worth the support of the federal government to make it go. And of course, many people are reliant on the federal Postal Service. And when you compare it to privatized services like FedEx or UPS, the difference in cost to do the things that it does are prohibitive. Many of us could not do simple mail or get simple mailings if we had to go through UPS or FedEx. Anyway, that's a lot of complication, right? That's a big, complicated thing. And yet right now, we are simplifying that down in these cartoons to some simple ideas. One just simply that right here, Trump is, literally gunning for the UPS, and if not shooting the driver, and there's no driver here, right? Maybe shooting the tire and making it impossible for it to work. Another kind of similar, maybe, but different, is the idea that the Postal Service is bleeding and has been on life support for a long time. And in fact, it's the red ink of bureaucracy that is trying to keep the Postal Service going, but it's bleeding out, right? And it's bleeding out here, I think, is double coated, both as blood, right, with an injection going on here, but here also as kind of like leaky oil stains of the vehicle moving down. Here, of course, you get a reduction of it to memory of the vow of the Postal Service that nothing, rain, snow, gloom of night, stands in the way of delivering the mail. But the Trump assault, especially around mail-in voting and the presumption, which may in fact be true, that part of the assault on the Postal Service or the attempt to radically reform it at this point is really an attempt to curtail its ability to facilitate mail-in voting or absentee voting during a time of pandemic. So it's a complicated issue, our Postal Service and the support for the government, and why it's in a crisis right now and why Trump is trying to change it. But the cartoons themselves are relatively simple. Trump is gunning for it. It's bleeding out while it's also on life support from federal red tape and federal red ink. And then last but not least, the nemesis of the Postal Service, of the postal carrier, has always been the dog. And here's Trump as the dog, literally and intentionally trying to hamper the delivery of the mail. All of those, I think, are examples. You could probably find many more. It's just necessary. You got one panel, right? You can't get all the nuance and subtlety of the situation into one panel. It's going to, by necessity, be a reduction or simplification of the issue that it represents, usually trying to highlight an important element of that, maybe to put the blame on Trump, maybe to put the blame on the federal government, maybe to put the blame on the Postal Service itself. Regular characters. Here, what I think we mean is obviously a figure like the president is going to be a regular character to show up in political cartoons. And I think probably on every screen I share, he's going to show up. There are also regular and familiar characters that we see across presidencies and really across the history of US political cartoons and periodicals. One of the more famous ones, of course, is the Statue of Liberty as a stand-in for our country and as a stand-in for our emphasis on liberty, but also our emphasis on the idea of a caring feminine presence to take care of immigrants and to take care of the nation. You rarely see the Statue of Liberty going to war, but you do see the Statue of Liberty upholding our liberal values of freedom and freedom of expression and the right to immigrate and the care that we have as a nation, the care that we take for each other. And of course, when you want to be critical of a current administration, you perhaps demonstrate the president abusing the Statue of Liberty, or the Statue of Liberty, as in this case, being ashamed of the discourse of Americans, right? Here, the argument here, of course, is that if you really follow the logic of Trump supporters and make America great sloganeers, they would not be happy with the Statue of Liberty. The symbol of America itself ain't white, she's green because of the way, you know, the patina is forming on her because of weathering over time. And she also comes from France. So, you know, I think the juxtaposition of their anti-immigration and their intolerance for difference thrown at the Statue of Liberty is one of the ways that this comic is functioning here. I thought these two are very interesting because they're very different comics from different places, but sometimes comics land on similar ideas. And of course, the image here, it's a violent one, the beheading of Lady Liberty, that's hard. But I think the other reference, if you were going to try and say, hey, maybe there's another regular character that's being referenced here, is this looks a bit like Perseus beheading Medusa. And so that image is also kind of playing out here as a kind of allusion or reference. But even two different cartoons can play with a very similar idea. And finally, I think this is a more, to me, traditional way of sometimes representing the Statue of Liberty, that, you know, the Statue of Liberty steps up and does what's necessary. I'm surprised she's not wearing a mask in this particular cartoon right here, because she, you know, here she is holding out the hand sanitizer and soap have replaced the torch and the tablet that she carries, as this is what America has to do right now. We have to hand sanitize, we have to wear soap, we have to do what we're doing. So these regular characters might show up. Think of figures like Uncle Sam, who sometimes shows up in these cartoons, or the big fat cat, or the Monopoly player, or sometimes the figure of Wall Street that's a big, sometimes represented as a pig, but very big and large and taking all your money. Those would be examples of regular characters that you see kind of showing up as symbols for ideas or concepts that others will recognize and get relatively quickly. There's two kinds of hyperbole that Pierce gives us, and I want to try and parse them, if you will, pierce them, haha, just a little bit here. One is just simply the idea of non-narrative hyperbole, and here we might talk about things like caricature, exaggeration, and representation. And the idea that I'm kind of working on here, there's two that when we represent Trump, I would say there's three things that often you get seen done over and over again as exaggerations of him. One is his size. Here it's probably done the most. His size is exaggerated, that he is a largish man, and we're going to fat shame him for it. And so that becomes one of them. Another is his hair. He's so particular about his hair, and this particular shape that gives a kind of visor coming off the front has become a kind of signifier for him. But probably the most egregiously exaggerated element that has become his stand-in element is his necktie, usually a red necktie, but always super long. He wears it long, and then the cartoons will exaggerate it, draping all the way to the floor, draping all the way to the floor in front of a toilet over here where he's flushing truth, or here in his cabinet meeting, draping all the way onto the table. You see the long tie as a kind of point of humor. It's happens quite a bit that you find an element of, in caricature, that you tend to find an element, usually in the face or facial features, that you can exaggerate for effect. So for example, I think if you looked at a lot of cartoons with Obama, one of the things that they exaggerate even bigger than, and Obama's got some big ears, right? But they'll make his ears even way bigger. And the shape of his head has a particular teardrop, reverse teardrop shape. And so the size of his forehead will often be exaggerated as well as a kind of image. So the idea of non-narrative hyperbole is pretty central to the idea of caricature to begin with. And it really just applies here to the idea of let's take usually a representational element and exaggerate it, make it bigger, make it grotesque. Well, so what's narrative hyperbole? Narrative hyperbole is sometimes taking a situation and exaggerating the effect of it. And it's a little bit tricky sometimes, and they can overlap each other. I think they might be happening here. But these are a couple of cartoons that happened recently in response to a rally, a 4th of July rally that Trump had at Mount Rushmore, also known as Six Grandfathers in South Dakota. A story emerged relatively quickly after that, the White House had reached out to see if it was possible to add a face to Mount Rushmore, ostensibly to add Trump's face to Mount Rushmore. In the past, folks wanting to honor Ronald Reagan, for example, have argued maybe we could add Ronald Reagan's face to Mount Rushmore. By the way, you probably wouldn't know this, but Mount Rushmore, the rock, is what they would call rotten. It's full of fractures, and so there's no real place left on Mount Rushmore that would support another carving. And in fact, if you were to try and do it, you would probably damage the carvings that are already up there. I think that these are pretty good examples of narrative hyperbole, where we imagine, for example, in this one to the right, that Trump is in his speech, that the founding fathers, or the fathers who are celebrated, the presidents who are celebrated on Mount Rushmore, are rolling their eyes at his content. And so, let's just imagine that if they could hear what he's saying, they would roll their eyes. And wouldn't it be funny to see that actually happen on Mount Rushmore? Or here, for example, I think you get a kind of joke about social distancing and what that would do to Mount Rushmore, that they would have to separate apart. And it's taking the kind of narrative idea of social distancing and imagining that something like the Mount Rushmore heads would have to social distance, and giving us a look at what that might look like. Again, it's taking an element of the narrative of social distancing in our response to pandemic and exaggerating that using Mount Rushmore as the iconography for it. And of course, down here, this is actually from a cartoon that's used to illustrate an argument about why Mount Rushmore is evil. That taking Six Grandfathers, a mountain that is revered by the Lakota people, and transforming it into a celebration of very white presidents who are responsible for, maybe not those presidents directly, but have contributed to the isolation and in some cases genocide of the native population of this country, is tantamount to the idea of, why don't we take these famous, Dr. Doom, Darth Vader, Cobra Commander, etc. Why don't we make those the faces on Mount Rushmore, and you can understand how evil Mount Rushmore is. It's really sort of taking the idea of what is Mount Rushmore, what does it symbolize, what does it operate as, and exaggerating it. It's even taking the idea of the Trump administration doing its rally at Mount Rushmore, and maybe even looking into the possibility of adding himself to Mount Rushmore and running with that. There were some other images. They were not in the form that I could share here, of cartoons that, of course, have adding an ass, a donkey's ass, or human buttocks to Mount Rushmore is the way that one might add Donald Trump. What's happening there is you're having a reference to current events, an exaggeration of that reference, a certain simplification of it, but an exaggeration beyond anything that anybody is really calling for about Mount Rushmore. Okay, let's turn here at the end to memes. Why do I want to go to memes? Well, first of all, as the Smithsonian article actually gets you to, the term that we use for memes, we often mean content that's spread on the internet that usually is some combination of an image and words. And so when you look at meme generators or meme makers, like in some of the links in the PDF that I gave you, you will see that, well, memes mean something a little bit more than just that, but at least in common parlance, we've tended to reduce them to these images with words added to them. The idea comes from Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist, who Richard Dawkins offered that there is not just evolution of beings, there is an evolution of ideas. And that ideas are really much more important. In part, this is coming out of some reconceptualization of how DNA works, such that really it's probably better to conceptualize DNA as a mode of transferring information. But what Dawkins kind of hits on is that the gene is to biology what the meme is to culture. That the gene is a piece of information in your cells that tells you what eye color you have, or what size hand you are, how tall you are, all those kinds of those pieces of information that are encoded in your DNA and RNA. And the meme is an idea that similarly is transmitted through culture, that culture is built on little ideas that get communicated and reinforced over time. So really any idea that goes viral is a meme, and memes in Dawkins' view pre-exist the internet. But the reason why it's come to popularly mean a bit of brief online content, usually a still photo with words on it, is that those circulate widely. And they have a couple of elements to them that even tie back to old folkloric practices. So for example, they're usually anonymous. We never ask, hey, who made that meme? And even though you can go and make a meme, right, it's really technically not a meme until it gets popular and circulates around beyond you and people are sharing it who don't even know you. But of course we can't in this class make a meme like that. What we can do is we can practice and put some images on some words on some images. It usually also works in a kind of comic frame of combining images with words. And even though it's typically a single image, there's certainly lots of examples of memes lately that have moved to multiple images and even working like a little comic strip. Maybe we'll take a look at some of those here in a second. So they also use familiar figures. You're probably familiar with the Willy Wonka one that goes around. But I love the Boromir one from Lord of the Rings. And here are 3 examples of it, right? One of the things that I love about this one here up on the left is that here's Boromir making the recognizable phrase, "One simply does not walk into Mordor," is the line from the show, from the movie. But usually taken and changed to other things. And here, one does not simply escape the coronavirus. So we got the structure of the words. They're added onto what he's saying with the gesture. But then also somebody's added a mask, which I think transforms this gesture just a little bit. So all of these additions, linguistic and visual additions, add to a familiar figure and a familiar meme that already circulates widely. One does simply not go to sleep. One does not simply go to sleep without a fan on. I mean, one can, but it's an assertion of opinion. It's not a deep philosophical or political idea. This might be about coronavirus. This is about something common and everyday that we experience. And then memes have a way sometimes of getting meta here. Notice that the image is slightly different, taken from a different moment, a few seconds off from this gesture. And then also uses this moment to kind of become reflexive and comment on the idea of making memes. Kind of fun, right? So familiar characters happen a lot, and you think about how you see a lot of different memes. And one of the memes that you could potentially make this week is to go to one of those meme generators and get some of the familiar images that get circulated and add your own text to them, and that can make a meme as well. I believe the meme generator, one of the sites that I offered you, does precisely that. It provides you with the basic image, and then you get to add the language to it. Okay. They can take a multi-comic form, and these can get actually quite complicated and long, so that you can have exchanges back and forth. So think of the dogs that tell puns, or think of the 2 figures. I can't remember what the show is that they're from, but they're sitting in a radio studio and they're having an argument with each other, and you kind of track that out. This one, of course, is a combination of 2 different images. One is the angry cat, which was its own meme for a while. The other is the angry women from I can't remember which of the Housewives reality show it is, and some of the backstory on what this is taken from maybe make you a little uncomfortable about this as a meme. I get it. But in some ways it moves beyond, I don't have to know what this is from, and I don't have to know what this is from. These 2 images paired of the kind of argument between a woman and a cat at a dinner table have become quite popular. And they argue about really silly things like specific versus Pacific, and you don't put fruit on a pizza. A tomato is a fruit too, stupid. So the kind of back and forth that the cat and the angry person have, the angry woman have, are part of the comic, but part of the meme here. And this meme is really, I think now, once you start, certainly it's already in comics territory and cartoon territory when it's just one single image and words. But when you start adding images together and showing a kind of relationship between them, then you are starting to move into the realm of juxtaposed art, that is the sequential art of comics. This one is interesting to me because, of course, a meme structure can be borrowed. And so here is the basic structure. Now using and moving to drawing, we could just as easily here have done photos and some photo manipulation, but this artist has drawn a scene from Star Wars. I forget which one, but I think it's one of the prequels. You know, the "You're Holding Me Back, Ready You Are Not" is a Star Wars reference. You have to know yours to kind of get what's happening here, but you also really have to know the meme to understand what it's sort of mocking here and making fun of. And all of those kinds of connections and resonances really play across the image, play across the meme, and the idea of an idea not just being transmitted in culture, but being transmitted and transforming as it is transmitted and applied within the culture. Okay. So why are we making memes this week? Well, in the past, I've tried to actually have folks make political cartoons. And what I've learned from that is the anxiety that we have around drawing gets in the way. So for me, this is a way to get us to appreciate the challenge of memes and editorial cartoons. They're not easy to make. If you spent time trying to put some words to an image, it's very hard to get inspired. And then you might have one that you really think is inspired, but it doesn't get picked up and spread around very often. So what you're really doing is making an art object with some words added to an image. And that's great. But I do think that in that performance as knowing mode, we can learn something from the effort, from trying to do the work here of making a meme, of coming up with some image and word relationship to each other and making a point fast and quick. You can learn something about the complexity of the practice by trying your hand at it. So that's a good thing, right? I also want us to get some practice in at manipulating and adding to images, right? Because our goal here, and one of the ways that we can share, if we're meeting together, we could come in and we could, you know, point at the comic book and show things. And maybe we can do that a little bit in Zoom. But the truth of the matter is we need to be able and to develop an ability to draw and point to things that are happening on a comic page. And so my hope is by learning to make memes, we might also learn to be able to do some performative additions, if you will, to comics pages that'll help us see what's going on there and help us move through the key elements that you want to point out or make me aware of. Finally, we want to start experimenting with the tensive relationship of words to images. This, I think, is really useful for us and probably going to be one of the most important takeaways from this class for you. McLeod is going to give us quite a bit to work with in terms of thinking of different ways that the words of the image content can be related to each other, juxtaposed with each other, or not related with each other, and what effects come with that. But here I want us to just on our own start experimenting with what's the relationship of the words to the images. And as you start looking at the memes that you're producing yourselves and that your classmates are producing, I want you to ask, what's happening here? What's the relationship of the image to the words and the words to the image? How did the words change the image? How did the image change the words? And what kind of potential is there? And then the real trick is to start thinking as a live performer or as a performer in some kind of mediated context about what kind of relationship can you make between the words you are saying, the words that you might have printed out or available to you as a visual aid, and the images or other things that you might put on the performance space. What's their relationship to each other? And to take a comics sensibility and understanding of that tensive relationship and apply it to your own performance work and build something that is informed by this particular form that is so central to the work with comics. Okay, so that's it for our, that's it. That's it for this week. I hope that you will find this useful, and I will see you probably in the Zoom on Thursday. I'm sorry this got up so late. I will do my best to try and get stuff up a little bit earlier as we go forward, but I had a lot of catch up to do in terms of getting the class architecture up this week. So also please let me know either online or at Zoom next week if you're having any trouble accessing this content. This is our first shot at a rather long lecture, and I'm very curious to see how effective it was for you and if it gave you what you needed. All right, so I'll see you on Thursday. and be sure to check the D2L for places to drop off your memes and other ways to contribute and participate in class. See you on Thursday.